Happy Wednesday. Certainly feels like a Wednesday at the speed that I am moving. Fortunately, I am moving much faster than I was on Monday. However, no guarantees that I won't be rambling again tonight, of course. All right, we should have everyone. Let's kick it off with what happened at OpenHack. What did I miss? What were your guys' thoughts? Yes, I can ramble about things I wasn't even involved in. What was something maybe that you got out of it, something that you were surprised about, something that you really just enjoyed having the opportunity to do, something you absolutely hated it? Kind of met expectations for everyone, no surprises. Picking Ryan's brain about density, always a good opportunity to definitely sample around, to talk to local employers, kind of figure out what their day-to-day looks like. It is outside of Hack Upstate's semi-annual hackathon. It is probably the biggest gathering of developers, especially on a regular basis, in Syracuse. So really great opportunity because they're there to socialize, right? And so it's a great opportunity to do that and kind of pick their brains without having to go and find out the employer and speak to HR and all that kind of stuff. So really great opportunity. Karen, great point about missing them until you went. I'm glad they got a good crowd. I think they are growing in popularity and people just want to get out post pandemic. So really, really glad that you guys were able to make it out. Okay, switching gears, what did we cover from Monday? What was the big thing we kind of focused on, or what was the flow? We started our appliance ERD. We kind of already had the ERD though. We kind of cheated and used mine. What was the other acronym that I threw out there? That flow chart that we used? Does anyone remember what that was called? The data flow diagram, or the DFD. Yeah, you guys got it. And so that's a good process, and not always, it doesn't have to be a technical thing either, right? You can do a DFD around how the business is currently working, and it's really just identifying that almost every business runs on data, right? There's always data getting passed around. Even if you're talking about repairing a toaster oven, there is data that it takes to pull that off, right? And so we use our data flow diagram to identify not only what the core processes are of, all right, what's transforming that data, when do we collect that data, all of that stuff, but who provides that data or who receives that data, and where does that data get stored? And those are really and then what is the order of that data flow? How does it interact with those people? And those are really the core tenets of doing a data flow diagram. So we didn't have time to do a deep dive into them, but the good news is they are much easier to create than an entity relationship diagram, right? Less principles, less arguing about whether you should put data in this table or this table. It's more of just this general high level, hey, how's this happening? And oftentimes non-technical people will be hired to do that for a business. A business may be running smoothly, but because they don't have their data flow documented, they may be realizing that they're running into problems that they don't even know they're having. So Once we got that done and kind of went over the data flow document, what was the step that we did before we dived into the wireframes? Didn't have a real technical name, but there's one term that I'm looking for. The list of pages and tasks, the touch points from the four processes, the requirements is really what I was going for, right? Is we need our requirements. And so the requirements can take many different forms. So we kind of just started going at it up like, let's throw out bullet points. We've got our four processes. Let's figure out kind of what needs to be done on all four of those screens. And then from there, we can start identifying, oh, if we're going to need to do that, we probably need another page. And that's what's going to help us start figuring out in our wireframes what all the different screens we're going to need are. So once we got that done, once we got our pages done, we jumped ship back into diagrams.net. And this time, instead of doing a DFD or an ERD, we just started with a blank diagram. And the whole point of that is we don't have to worry about it being pretty. We don't have to worry about what Bootstrap components we're using. We just want to get page structure out. We just want to understand what's going to show up on this screen. Doesn't have to be dummy data, but we need to understand the nav bar. We need to understand where basic buttons are going to go. We need to understand what the table on this page is going to show or what the screen content is going to be without worrying too much about design. Now that process, like we've already said, is a little fungible, right? Like you can go in there and go, oh, I'll do a little bit more design in my diagrams, or oh, maybe I'll skip the mock-up step. So just want to reiterate that this process is not one that is set in stone or one that you necessarily have to do in order, right? It makes sense that, hey, before you get into the database, maybe you want to finish up your ERD, but there's nothing saying the ERD has to be the first thing we do. In fact, I probably wouldn't do the ERD first, but I kind of wanted to put a bow on the database module before we got back to the full stack app. So the requirements, with that said, we will be using our ERD tonight to figure out what information we need to get to show up on the screen. So it is sometimes helpful to have your ERD done before you wireframe as opposed to after you wireframe. So really depends, right? End goal is just let's get planning done before we start touching code. So now we've got our database planning done. And before we even got to wireframes, we're like, whoa, this business case is a bunch of paragraphs. We need to break down what they're really trying to do with this app. So that's why we did our DFD. We identified those four processes. And now we are going back to our wireframe and going, all right, we've got our flows figured out, our diagrams figured out. Let's just break this down into a list and get our pages from it. And now we've kind of cleared any hurdles we need for the wireframe, right? We know what data is getting collected. We know where it's getting stored in the database. And now all we have to do is get it out on the screen. So we are going to spend some more time tonight getting it out on the screen. And when you have had enough of diagrams.net, we're going to dive into React land. So I would love to lie to myself and say that we will get to full stack tonight. Chances are we'll still probably be building out the front end. And I am probably going to go a little bit quicker. I will slow down for the project setup touch points, right? Make sure that you guys can get your React project set up. Make sure, did Joey cover React router at all with you guys? Okay, cool. So we're going to get the router set up today because we definitely need support for multiple pages. And we're going to kind of just dive in from there. But want to get a couple pages wireframed out before we get to that point. We're going to identify on MVP for this of, all right, minimum viable product. Do we really need reports working, by the end of the week? No, probably not. okay, what do we really need? We probably need to go through all of those things of creating the customer, creating the appliance, creating the service order. So those are the top 3 things that we're going to focus on tonight, and probably tomorrow as well. Is let's get all of that working in the database. And then next week we can decide, all right, do we want to lean over to that e-commerce project, or do we want to keep going on this appliance project and tackle some other things there? So there is likely a poll headed your way of a long list of features, and you guys can kind of pick your priority of which ones you would want to do. So I will get that together by Monday, but for now we are going to dive back into the wireframes. Does anyone have questions while I'm pulling things up? I need to pull up the requirements list, and then we will be good to go. I'm going to try and do this on my big monitor so I don't have to be craning my neck for the smaller one. Okay. So good thing to kind of touch base, make sure we remember where we're at before we get trucking on our requirements. So we have our login page, and we were starting at the customers page. Now there are really 3 pages that I just mentioned we need to focus on, right? We need to focus on our service orders, our appliances, and our customers. Why is that? Because all of that is going on in this first data flow of creating the service order. And what we identified up in our requirements was that when we create a service order, there are really 3 things that we have to focus on. And the receipt we'll hopefully get to, but we have to create a new customer if they're new. We've got to create the appliance if it's not already in the database. And then we have to create the service order. And that service order is going to be pulling all of that information in, right? So what we are going to do is I'm going to pull up our ERD so we have that to reference as well. Okay. So we were on the customer screen. Now, what are probably where do we start with screen design, especially when we're working with data? Right? Because we can look at this and we're like, blank slate. What do we put in here? How do we figure out what we put in here? We are back to module 7, week 2 of module 7. Latonia, essentials. Yeah, what's essential? How do we figure that out?
Well, you told us before we would always have like users, and we can use that as a starting point.
Yep. So we can start with tables. Shaw, I think you're on the right track. We can look at our ERD and we go, all right, our customers, we've got first name, last name, phone number, address, city, state, zip code. So I think you're on the right track of we should be able to pull our information out on all of our customers and show that in a table. But that's one operation, right? We're pulling that customer data out. What else do we have to be able to do to that customer data? Well, we have to be able to add them in. That's our create. And hey, create, read. That sounds familiar. There are two other letters in that. Create, read, update, delete. Oh, okay. There's our CRUD, right? And so while we have kind of shown all of our endpoints of creating those 4 endpoints and using SQLize to create or update the data, we also need to identify that the end user likely needs all 4 of those operations. Now, there are times that you would change the operations based off of a role, right? A user at the front desk is probably able to read all of the other users at the repair shop, but they're probably not able to delete them, right? The front desk person isn't allowed to just say, hey, this employee is gone, remove them from the system. So create, read, update, delete is a guideline to start at, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to give all roles the ability to do that, right? And for something even like our repair statuses, ideally, yes, the manager would be able to go in and update them. But there are times that we would just say, no, you've got to contact a developer to do that because there may be repercussions in the database of adding in different repair statuses. So while CRUD is a good starting point, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to use CRUD for every single table in the database. And we may find that we are doing CRUD not only on the table itself, but on other pieces of the database, right? When we create our service order, we already talked about, well, we're going to need some customer information to show up on that service order. So we're going to do a join there. And there may be other information that shows up as well, like the appliance make and model and all of that stuff. But for now, we're going to start with our table. So I'm going to figure out if there is a table I can use in diagrams.net. Let's see if this is going to work with me. Can I save changes? Just want to make sure that we can add additional columns. And I know we figured out how to do that with the ERD because we basically dragged out another row from over here. Not going to be as simple as doing that again, is it? Those are rows. Where are... Okay, so I can reuse that. Is it going to let me do... Someone beats me to figuring out how to do a column, let me know. Arrange under table. Okay, arrange table. Oh, would you look at that? Those buttons would have been helpful during the ERD. Okay, so thank you, Shaw, for finding that. If you click on the table and go to arrange, there are all of these buttons here, and they allow you to either add columns over on the right or add rows down at the bottom. I'm not sure if we had that available to us when we did the ERD, but man, is that a much easier way of... If you look at that, they're still there. You could also do that on the ERD. So pro tip for you. And Shaw also mentioned that you can click on a row and duplicate it. So good tips. Okay, so we're going to label this. We're going to call this our customers table. And our customers table is actually going to be pretty easy, right? We can actually pull up our ERD and we've got first name, last name. Now, why do you think we keep first name and last name separate? We could do it to alphabetize. It could also be that last name could change, but first name could also change. So if we just called it name, we could always change both of them. Different people could have the same last name, but two customers could share the same first name and last name. So that doesn't matter why we don't combine them. Any other guesses as to why we don't combine them? In general, it's much easier to, Carolyn, you're on the right track there. With the smaller chunks of data, easier to manage. It's much easier to put data together than it is to pull data apart, right? So what happens if your first name has two names in it? Well, now all of a sudden, if you go, oh, well, I know what their last name is because there's a space between their first name and their last name. So I'm just gonna split it out on that. If all we do is store name, then I can get last name by just doing that. Then you go, well, what happens if the last name is hyphenated? Or what happens if they have two last names that have a space in it? How do I know what their first name is and what their last name is? And so it's much better to keep data separated in the database as much as you can, and then put that data together in just a string and a concatenate than it is to just assume, oh, let me store this all in one big field. Is it a little harder for the user to enter because now there are two fields? Yes, but they're already going to be tabbing through data to insert their address 1, address 2, city, state, all of that stuff. So not the end of the world for us to do that. And so, yes, we want to keep it in the smallest chunks possible. And that's also why we keep address, city, state, and zip code all apart, because, oh, what happens if you forget to enter a zip code for someone? So that's why we keep it all separate. Okay, so in here, it's pretty easy. We're just going to say first name, last name, we'll say phone number. Now, for the purposes of presentation, you know what? All we care about here is showing their whole address. We don't necessarily need to show address 1, address 2, city, state. So we're just going to combine all of that information when we show it in the user interface. And then we also need that's everything. So we're going to start coming in here with some dummy data. So Testy Mick Testerson has a phone number of 123-456-7890 and lives at 123 Main Street, Syracuse, New York, 13212. Now, the point of doing this, right, is in a wireframe, you may not put dummy data in, but in a mockup, you kind of have to. And here's why. Notice our zip code disappeared. That's allowing us to start to identify, hey, this row size isn't big enough. We're either going to need to adjust these columns, or we're going to need to handle and account for a bigger row size. So what the wireframes let us start to do are really more the mockups, allow us to start identifying, hey, something's a little off there, or you know what, it's kind of hard to tell the difference between first name and Testy. So maybe what we want to do is take our first row and add a little styling of a fill to it. And we'll make the fill just like a light gray. And now all of a sudden that makes it stand out of, oh, that's the table header, right? So little design elements will help here. Okay, so we are going to just take Testy and hopefully copy and paste them down so we understand that there are multiple values in this table for different customers. We tend to not do more than 2 or 3 dummy data things unless we really need to play around with the layout and the sizing and all of that stuff. Yes, and we're just putting all those elements together in the display. So we'll practice in our front end code of getting that data and merging that all down together. We're not actually merging it in. Okay. So we got our read going on. I'm going to just shrink up this table because we don't need those rows down at the bottom. Okay, let's talk about our entering our customer data. How do we enter customer data, especially on a web app? What do we kind of need? We need that form input. Yep. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to grab some text here and I'm going to say add a customer. And I will shrink this down because that is obnoxiously big. And let's underline that. Let's see what font size this is, just for consistency. Okay, so we're going to add our customer. And this is going to be exactly what you're expecting. I'm going to just grab rectangles. And I'm going to say first name. And just do some quick styling cleanup. So our fill, we are going to just remove. Maybe we want to move our text over to the left. And then we are going to change our font color to a darker gray. And what we're implying there is that our first name is going to kind of show up as the placeholder, right? And as soon as they start typing that in, first name is going to disappear. So we're just going to copy and paste that, and we're going to add in our last name. And maybe we'll do one more form over here. That's going to be our phone number. I'm copying and pasting with Command C and Command V. There's also a way that if you hold in Command and drag, it automatically duplicates that for you. So little shortcuts in there. Okay, and I'm going to drag this over so it is clear that we're using half the screen. And then I'm going to copy all of these and just, I'm using Command click to select multiples, and then I'm just going to, oh, come on. Command click and then Command drag to add in more fields. I'm going to try and get them to line up. And now I'm going to add address 1, address 2, and we'll say city. Maybe we'll try and copy a couple of these in just to be able to fit more in. And then I'll do my zip code. Okay, all on the right track. What's the one thing we're missing here to finish up our create operation? Our submit button. You got it, Kyle. So I'm just going to drag that out. And you know what? If I get fancy, I can even go down to Bootstrap and I'm going to find my button and drag that in. Now, one thing that you'll see a lot is the button says submit, right? And because as a developer, we think about that and we go, well, that's a submit button. The type is submit, it's submitting the form. And submit turns out to be a terrible UX decision because the end user isn't thinking about this as submitting a form. They're thinking about this as adding a customer. And so they're like, submit what? Am I submitting something to the customer? Where's that data going, right? So submit is this easy thing for us to say. The next most ambiguous is save. Well, save what? I'm trying to add a customer. Am I saving the customer information up here? Am I saving it in? Obviously, it's a little bit more clear that, okay, we're saving the user customer, but I like to keep in line with my title. So we said add a customer here. So we can say add customer and they understand, okay, now when I click that button, it's actually going to add the customer in for me, right? So more specific button labels just to be a little bit more clear. Okay, create and read done. What is next? Got to be able to update our customers. So I'm going to see if I can grab and do a search for pencil because pencil is known for editing. This looks more like an icon. So I'm going to drag that out and shrink it down. And while I'm in there, I'm going to also need a delete. So let's get a little trash can, hopefully, and pull that out as well and shrink that down. Now, you guys have probably seen 40 gazillion different ways of editing data, right? I'm just going to copy and paste this down to the next row. Hopefully. Oh, you shrunk that down for me for no good reason. Okay, so what are you guys thinking from a user experience perspective? When that edit button is clicked, what happens? There is no right answer here. There are multiple options. So this is more of a what do you think should happen, or using software in the past, what has happened in the past? So a cursor could appear in the field boxes, right? We could definitely make this so all 4 of these turned into text inputs, and then this edit icon would change into like the little floppy disk and you could hit save. But we run into a problem with that. What happens when we're editing this address? How do we keep track of what is the address 1, address 2, city, state, zip? We could make 5 inputs show up in here, but now we can see how many inputs are going on down here. 5 of them showing up, not the best option. So we could add to this table, but I kind of like how clean this table is, right? We're not just throwing a ton of fields at them. It's making it easier for them to read. So edit in the table, definitely an option, definitely something we could do. I'm a little hesitant to do it just because this address is combined. So what are our other options for when we click that edit button? We could do a pop-up. Yeah, and we could do a pop-up as 2 different ways. We could make it so you could edit, we could put an edit button in each of these fields, and when you hit the edit button, we would get that window.prompt that we would pop up, and we would say, what would you like to change the first name to? But we don't have control over that UI. Okay, well, we could do a modal, right? So a little modal is going to pop up, and it's going to have all the customer information, and it's going to say save, and we could hit the save, and that's fine. So totally good option to do a modal. Little more work, though, to involve with the styling, pulling in the bootstrap component, all of that stuff. Notice we've got our add a customer down here. This is the 3rd way we could do it. Well, our add a customer could really be our edit a customer. We could make it so instead of add a customer, we can say edit customer, and then grab a little note here for future self. Grab a little note here that says, not that one that's going to have the text showing up right. They have a sticky note where you can type the text right into it, but of course it wants to be a pain. Did I try that one? Yeah, I did. Okay. We're just going to grab regular text and drag that out. And we're going to say, when the edit button is pressed, load the row data into the edit form, the add form below, and change the label to say edit. So what we're going to do is we're going to borrow all of this because all the forms set up, we're going to invest all of that time into getting the form fields. They're exactly the same. So now instead of add customer, we are going to say, at this point, save is probably a safe thing to do. You're editing it, save the changes. You could call that edit customer if you wanted, not the end of the world, whatever you decide to do there. Okay. We should throw maybe one more note in here that says, confirm deletion before deleting in the database. Any other notes that you guys see on this? Any questions on the design? questions on how we got here? Is this kind of what you would expect to happen in the customer screen? Okie doke. We're going to keep on trucking here, but we are going to steal this entire customer's table. Actually, we're going to steal this whole thing. Just going to highlight all of that, copy, paste, and drag it on down. And rename this to our appliances screen. And I'm going to just change the styling on our customers button a little bit just to show that it's active. So I'm just going to add a little fill to that, and we'll pick a light gray and add that in so it's more clear our customers is selected. And then I'm going to repeat that here. I'm going to go to my appliances. I'm going to grab a light gray. Okay, our appliances, pretty much the same thing, right? We're going to do our appliances. We are going to say make and model. We don't need our phone number or our address anymore. We need to keep our edit and delete though. So I'm just going to grab these 4, hopefully, and drag them out, and then grab my table and go to arrange and kill my last 2 columns and change this to a edit. Let's look, Carolyn. We have in our appliances make, model, and notes. The serial number we have to keep over on the service orders, right? Because we need to reuse these appliances. So if 5 people are bringing in the same exact KitchenAid mixer, we're going to just create the KitchenAid as the make, and then the model is whatever the model number is. And then we would be able to reuse that appliance. So we would only need to create a new appliance if someone was bringing in an appliance we had never worked on before. So I'm going to take this out. I'm going to drag this over so our table's just a bit bigger. I'm going to delete out my phone number. Sometimes you would label this as edit/delete. I kind of prefer to leave it blank. It's pretty clear that the pencil and the delete are going to do that for us. So I'm going to grab those. I'm going to drag these over. Okay. Serial number does not get an ID because it's associated with our service order. So every time if a customer brought in 2 different appliances, we would create 2 different service orders for them. So we don't want to try and shove appliance serial anywhere else. There's always a 1-to-1 relationship between the service order getting created and the number of appliances coming in, right? 1 appliance for every service order. If we were going to store multiple appliances on the service order, we would have to do a bridge table where we would create something like appliances on service orders that would bridge appliances to service orders. And then that table is also where we would store that serial number as well. Okay, so down here, we are just going to add, edit, and appliance. And all we need here is really the make and the model. Pull these out, say add, save, change our label. Yes, I have definitely worked on mockups where I forgot to edit this and the developer gets super confused and goes, why does it say add, save customer on the appliance screen? No reasons, because I'm perfect and I didn't miss that at all. Okay, so we've got our make and our model here. We should probably make it clear what our test data is going to look like. We'll just say mixer and oven. Any questions on that?
Yeah, not to be picky, but model is usually a number or something.
Yeah, I mean, we could call this, you know.
It would be, but like what you have in there would be type.
Yeah, because the data is storing make and model. We could add type to the data model if that's something where they said, I want to know how many how many mixers we do, but just because the ERD is set up the way it is, we'll roll with it. We'll roll with this.
Or you could add like mixer next to MX1 and so forth too.
Right, but we want to think about the ripple effects of doing that. If we add it to the wireframe, that means we've got to go back to the ERD and add it to the ERD. Then we also have to think about type being something that the manager is able to create more appliance types, right? Electric pressure cookers, not a thing that were around 10 years ago or popular 10 years ago. And now all of a sudden everyone has an Instant Pot, right? So we want to think about the ripple repercussions of, oh, let me just throw that in the mock-up, because there are a lot of people or a lot of steps involved both before and after. We can't just throw things in the wireframe and go, oh yeah, let's just code that in. We've got to adjust our ERD for that. And then we also need to think through, okay, now we need to design more screens to add the type and all of that kind of stuff. So if that were a business requirement handed to us, that is definitely something we would say, all right, we've got to go back and do all of that work. The flip side of that is also when you're designing something and you go, oh, type is something that makes a lot of sense for the appliance. That is when you have a running list, a document for your requirements version 1.1, where you go, oh, let me see if I can add a type into this, right? Because where you want to finish all of 1.0 before we go back and adding in new features of version 1.1. And so that's when we would keep a running list and then consult the client and say, hey, I think it makes sense to add type, as opposed to just dumping a type in there and the appliance owner or the repair shop owner going, type, we don't track type, right? Like we've got a filing cabinet of service orders and we just go through them and pull them out. So something to think of, because the repair shop may not even have an appliances database right now, right? They might just be writing the name down on the form and not really thinking about that. Okay, so we've got our add save appliances. We've got one more screen that we need to accomplish tonight before we can get to code, and that is our services order. So we're going to rename this to service orders. Make that a little bigger. We're going to change our style here to our light gray. We're going to remove the light gray from that button. We are going to rename this service orders. We're going to keep it going, add edit, a service order. We are going to add save. Can just call that a order. Actually, let's introduce an abbreviation, an SO. Okay, now let's head back to our ERD. And our ERD has all kinds of information in it, right? But what we want to think about is, what do we actually want to show up in the table? Because there's actually going to be a details where we can click into the details and see more information about the service order. So I think in our services order, the service order ID is going to be really important. We normally don't expose IDs to the end user, but a technician working on something may actually have in the back of their head, oh, I've got 5 orders that I'm working on today, and just have the last couple digits of the ID memorized. So I think we're going to need ID and customer ID. I probably don't need to see the customer ID. I've got no idea what my customer ID numbers are, but maybe I want to see their last name. So let's just start there. So I'm going to say we need our service order ID. We need our customer last name. We probably would like hours spent, not too worried about. I think I can click on it to get those details. Drop off time, date promise, date repair, date pickup, all important things. We're going to have to show them somewhere. But when I'm looking at all of my service orders, I don't want a massive table with everything the database has in it. Date technician assigned, not too worried about. Payment confirmation ID, we can click on it to make that payment. Appliance serial, not too worried about. Okay, appliance ID. Let's take a minute there. Maybe I don't care about the model of the appliance, but I probably want to know like what the make of that appliance is. What if I'm looking at all of my service orders and I'm like, ooh, I was working on a KitchenAid. Which one of these is in the KitchenAid? I forget who that was for. So I'm going to make up the decision to throw in our appliance make. And by the way, there is a whole approval process that would go on for this, right? You're probably not going to show your ERD to the client and say, oh, I expect you to, watch an 8 hours YouTube video on database design and then give me feedback on my ERD. But for something like a mock-up or a wireframe, this is something that's getting to be presentable, right? This is something that you could definitely show to the client, and the client look at this screen and go, well, where's the model? I need to know the model information when I'm looking at that screen. And so showing mockups, getting approval on the mockups or the wireframe, definitely something to do. If you're only wireframing and you plan on mocking up as a separate step, I would wait to show the wireframes to the client, because they'll look at this and go, it's missing something, maybe a little bit more color. And you're like, oh my God, that's not the point of a wireframe. But if you're kind of doing everything in this one step, that's definitely something to consider of when do I share with the client. Carolyn, you said it's a visual. I would argue that an ERD is a visual, right? Like we're jumping into our code, and that's obviously not something that we would share. But a visual isn't really a good boundary.
It's just closer to what they probably would see on the screen. So to them, it's like they can relate to it. I mean, in that sense, it's more WYSIWYG.
Yes.
I guess is what I meant. Yeah.
Okay, let's hop back over here. So we've got our make going on. Now we're thinking, oh, those relations are going to be really important because we're going to have to pull data from more than one table here, but that's okay. Serial number, I'm not too worried about. Oh, we already did that. Sorry. Status ID. I think that's important enough to know in the service order what's open. Payment ID, I'm not too worried about. Notes, you got to be careful with notes in a table, because if you've got a paragraph or two of text, now all of a sudden your rows are all different heights, right? Because you're trying to get a lot of information in there. One trick you can do with notes is actually make the notes a tooltip. So if they hover over a little sticky note, then the note content shows up on top of the table as opposed to right in the table. Excuse me. Problem ID, I'm not too worried about. Estimated costs, I'm not too worried about. Okay, so we said status. So let's go ahead and throw a status on the right. And there are two more columns I know we are going to need. We are going to need our edit and delete, which we will grab in 1 second. Looking at this and looking at our ERD. Oh, I missed something. Oh, the dummy data I'll fix in a second. Looking at our ERD, what is one other thing we probably want to show up in the services order table that may not be apparent by just looking at the services order itself? The customer, but if you'll look, we actually already have customer last name over here. So there's one other crucial piece of information that isn't actually in the services order table, but we would want to show up. Estimated labor time, we could do, we're not too worried about that. We can always click into any of these service orders and get all of these details. So there's one other piece of information that's not actually in this table, but it is connected to this table. The parts I'm not too worried about, because again, if I want to go into the detail, I'm thinking about if I'm a manager, I want to see the technician. Shaw, I think we already got the status over here. So yeah, definitely status, Shaw, you're right. But the technician assigned is what I really want to see, because I want to see, hey, my technicians are working on 5 different things. I want to be able to see at a high level how many technicians are working on what. I want to be able to say, oh, he's working on an oven. That's going to be an all-day job, as opposed to, looking at someone else who's juggling a bunch of different service orders. So I'm going to add in technician, and let me see, technician, we'll just leave it as that, but we know we mean their name, right? If we're ever going to expose an ID to the end user, we're going to actually label that as the ID. But for something like technician, you can assume we're not going to show the technician ID. We're going to show the technician name, just because that makes more sense. So I'm going to just grab my edit and deletes from up here. I'm going to pull the diagrams.net. You really tick me off sometimes. Very carefully grab the move icon, drop them down in here. And I'm going to say our service order ID is going to be 1 and 2. Maybe it displays a little better if we put a little pound sign in front of them. Just a personal choice. We're going to say Testerson, Matthews, our appliance make. We will still keep with KitchenAid and Whirlpool. And now this may seem frivolous, but if you were to give this to a customer and they were looking at this table, they'd be like, why are there all those white squares there, right? If you look, this data is what makes it apparent that it's a table. So even though to you it's a table, you still want to fill in this data. So I'll say ready for pickup, and I will say awaiting repair. And then our technician is going to be Matthews and McTesterson, because who says our technicians can't be customers too? Okay, we've got one more thing to finish up here, and we've got some considerations to think about in this UI. So I'm gonna just drag this button down so we've got some space to work. When we create a service order, we are probably going to have more fields that show up than up here, right? So I'm going to pull my ERD off to the side just so I can reference all the fields. So service order ID, should we create an input for that? You're saying no, Kyle. Why?
Because that's going to be generated by the database.
Bingo. So we almost never want to create IDs ourselves or let a user edit the ID. So even though the ID is here, we don't want the user to be able to edit that and say, oh, I would actually like that to be ID number 5. Well, what if 5 already exists? Well, now you can tell the user, hey, ID 5 already exists, but why are you editing the ID in the first place, right? So one thing you could do is, if you are importing a bunch of things, or the business owner is like, we have a actual need to edit the ID, we generate our own IDs, or we include the customer name in it, or whatever it is, you can add another field to the table that says service order number and allow the user to edit that, but still keep the database and keeping track of the IDs there. Right. So it's normally a better option to not let the user be able to edit the ID and instead give them some other field that they think is the ID, right? Because this data integrity, super important, especially when we start linking those IDs together and going, oh, this has to link to the customers table or the technicians table. What if the user changes that ID? And so sometimes it's better just to obfuscate some of that information and just go, all right, we're going to use IDs under the hood. But if you want to use your own thing that you think is a primary key, you can use it to your heart's content. Remember, all the way back to Khan Academy, that was a requirement of the primary key, is the primary key can never change, because if it does change, it will break things in other tables. And the database actually has a whole mechanism for that called on delete, and then a bunch of different conditions like cascade or set to null. So if I delete a customer who has service orders, we can actually set up the database to delete all of their service orders when the customer gets deleted, or we can set up the database to set the customer IDs to null in the service orders when the customer itself gets deleted. But anyway, maybe going too much into the weeds there. Okay, so we don't need our service order ID in the form. What is the next most logical thing to add into the form? A man walks into a bar. I mean, a customer walks into an appliance shop. We want to add in the customer information, right? They're standing right in front of you. You want to associate, because if we look at our ERD, we know that our service orders has a customer ID. So I'm going to come over here. I'm just going to change this to customer ID, and I'm going to expect the user to, when they get a new service order, to go scroll up to the customer's page, figure out what their ID is here, and then scroll all the way down here and type in their ID. Okay, maybe that's a little bit of a stretch. What user interface would we use on this to make it so they could just enter the customer information and know that our database is able to keep track of all of that behind the scenes? Well, we would use a join to get that information out of the customers table. But from a user perspective, what kind of design element would we use? What kind of, if you were using a software and it said customer, and the whole point was to tie in the customer information, how do you think out of previous apps you have used, you would pick out the customer? Carolyn, you hit one of them, the drop down, or you hit two of them, the drop down or a pop-up. Yeah. So we could either make it so when they clicked on this, instead of it being an input, it would say maybe select a customer, and they would click that, they'd get a little modal, they'd probably get the table of customers, they could pick on the customer name, the modal would close, and it would drop their information into here. Or we could use the drop down, a pick list, a select, lots of different names for them. Whatever, for me, I think the select makes more sense. And the reason why I'm leaning into the select is the select has this notion of search built in, right? I can start typing in the customer's name and it's going to filter down to what customer I'm looking for in particular. And then we can track the ID of that customer under the hood when we need to save it into the database. So I'm going to roll into, I'm just going to call this customer. And then I'm going to find a little arrow here, a little triangle, and just rotate it and shrink it down and attempt to move it. And just look at that, I made a little drop down. I'm sure it's going to be that easy in the code, right? Right? All right, we'll tackle that later. Okay, so I'm just going to pull my ERD off to the side. So I have that here. We need to pull in our appliance information. Appliances. That's in another table and has IDs. That sounds familiar. Maybe we can just repeat our design pattern and copy our select here and move it over and make it so our select shows up as appliance. Okay, now I'm a naive user. I'm not a developer. I don't know how to make these interfaces. I'm sitting here and I'm looking at my customer and I type in my customer name and it doesn't show up. And I'm like, well, I'm creating a service order. Why isn't this creating? There are two things we could do. The better user experience would probably be some option in the dropdown where you could say create customer, and it would either pop open the modal or even better, take the text that had already been inputted and get that created. But because this is a boot camp and all of our time is limited, the other thing we can do is just add a little text in here that says, as a note to the user, create the customer and appliance on the other screens before creating service order. And that may be a little vague. So I'm going to say if the customer or appliance don't exist, because we don't want them creating a new customer if the customer already exists, then we will say create them on the other screens before creating service order. This is why you don't let developers write any text that shows up to the end users, because there's probably a much more eloquent way of wording all of that. But in this case, we just want to give them a heads up, right? And as part of our wireframes, we may actually want to include instructions on that so the end user knows what's going on. Okay. So let's keep it going here. Hours spent is the next thing on our ERD. Well, hours spent when we create a service order is always going to be 0. So we don't, right? We're not spending any time on it when the order first gets created. So do we need that in the form field? No. Drop off time. Do we need drop off time? Yes, it is a trick question. No, we don't need drop off time because the customer is already dropping off the appliance. So whenever we hit this add service order, it's going to just grab the current time and drop it in there for us, right? We actually don't want to allow the front desk clerk to be able to adjust the drop off time, because they may save everything until the end of the day and log it all into the system. We want to encourage them to log it as the customer comes in, make sure we're collecting the information, because what could happen is the front desk clerk could be there and realize that who they thought was a repeat customer wasn't, and they didn't actually have the customer's phone number or address or anything like that. Without that information, now they can't contact the customer. So we don't want to encourage the user to be able to fudge the drop-off time and say, oh, they actually dropped this off, 3 days after they actually did, and now the customer is saying, hey, but you promised it to me on this date. So drop-off time, something we're going to skip. Date promised, also going to skip that, because the technician needs to do an estimate and figure out how long it's going to take to repair it before we promise them at it at a certain time. So now we're starting to think there are actually going to be some empties in the database. We're going to need to tell the database, hey, we're going to allow some of these things to be null. Okay, date picked up. Well, the date hasn't been picked up. Date repaired has been repaired. All things we don't need. All things we don't need to put in there. Kyle, good question. Why on the ERD is drop-off time not a timestamp? It definitely could be. Normally we only use, I shouldn't say that. There are times that we use timestamped for created at. There are times we also use timestamp for whenever the row is updated. So we would want to be careful not to use a timestamp that would automatically update every time we updated the row. Because if we did that, every time we updated that and added in more hours spent or whatever it was, that drop-off time would change. So normally, if it is a value that you are going to be updating or generating yourself, you use a date. If it's something that you would like the database to generate for you, you would use a timestamp. In this case, we kind of want the database to generate the drop-off time for us, but we're going to generate the date over in the back end instead of generating it in the database itself. For something like hours spent, you could go either way on it, and it definitely could be a timestamp. I don't use a ton of timestamps unless I'm letting SQLize or the database take care of it for me. I just thought of drop-off time as something we would generate. That's why I made it the date time. But like I said, it could go either way. There's no real wrong answer there, because we could let the database generate it for us. Okay, date technician assigned, don't need. Payment confirmation ID, we don't need. Appliance serial number. All right, now we're talking. We do need an appliance serial number because that is unique to the service order. Okay, next up on the list, appliance ID. Well, we're pulling the appliance information from the dropdown. We don't need it. Status ID. Also don't need a status ID because that's automatically going to follow the workflow of awaiting estimate, right? Or awaiting technician, which is actually more accurate. We've got to assign the technician before we can create before the technician can create the estimate. So we can skip status ID. Payment ID, we can skip. Problem ID. Oh, now we're talking. We probably need another drop down for that. Estimated cost, we don't know yet because we've got to do the estimate. The last thing we need is a nice notes field. And just to round out our design, they might have a lot to say. So we're going to make that more of a text area as opposed to just a text field. And that design-wise is going to bother me, so I'm going to move that text up to the top. Holy moly. It's a lot of wireframing. How are we feeling? This helpful to kind of see? I think it's one of those things where you think, oh, well, that all makes sense. But then you go to do it on your own and you're like, I don't know where to start on that, right? So we're kind of merging our requirements list that we kind of just brainstormed and generated out all of our pages. And now we're starting to overlay our ERD in there as well and starting to think, okay, we've got a lot of stuff in the ERD that we need because we're going to save that information later, but we don't necessarily need that, to show up in every single page that we use our service order. So that's why this is so important, because as a full stack developer who is involved in every step of the process, it's only natural to create a table that has every single field in it. And it's like, just because we can show all the data doesn't mean we should be showing all of the data. Carolyn, problem ID wouldn't be a text entry because we store our problems in a separate table. So we actually keep track of our problems, but you do bring up a point. I probably shouldn't say problem ID because we don't actually want the problem ID to show up there. We'll just call that problem. But what we really want to show up is the description of the problem, or the problem name. I called it description in the ERD. That it may be better to call that name or to call it name and description, have two separate fields. Anyway, doesn't matter much either way. But putting ID in there, probably not the best option. Is this process making sense to you guys? Have you had enough wireframing or are begging to get back to code? Well, I've got good news for you. I am 18 minutes ahead of schedule. So we're going to take our break early, meet back here at 7 p.m. and we're going to get our terminal fired up and start making some front end stuff. Yes, Carolyn, notes would just be, oftentimes you'll design software and forget a notes field and the user will be like, but the customer told me this and I want to make sure the technician knows about that when they do the estimate. Or, there are a lot of times that you forget to put in a notes field and then they get really hacky and they start figuring out that appliance serial number is an open text field. So they'll put the serial number in there and dash and then start adding notes into the serial number. And then, oh crap, that field is only 255 characters long. So what do I do now, right? So notes is generally a good idea to think ahead on your ERD. And even if the business case client does not know to ask for notes, it's generally a good idea to add the notes in there. There is a notes in the ERD. And we identified that as text and not a varchar because there could be people like me who know how to talk and just talk in the notes. All right. take our breaks. We'll see you guys at 7 o'clock. Welcome back, everyone. Assignment number 57 has been posted in module 7, so do not get confused in Google Classroom because we're going back to module 7. I posted that over there. I think I didn't screw up the numbers. 56, I'm pretty sure, was the last assignment we did, so I'm hopeful that 57 is correct. Assignment 57 is basically to create the four wireframes that we created in class tonight. So you are free to use your own creative expression there to create them however you would like them to show up. There aren't any requirements that you have to use the exact same data. And I encourage all of you guys to start from the requirement sheet and kind of work your way into the mockups, as opposed to using the mockups that we created and creating your own variant of them. So in other words, go through the process as if you don't have the final product and design out the final product for yourself. You may be surprised at what you find in creating it yourself, as opposed to what we created in class. There are also a couple shortcuts that I know from being a developer of, oh, a select is going to be easier to do than a modal, so we're just going to roll with that, right? But if you wanted to design that in, there's often a discussion where you go back and forth with a UI or UX designer and say, hey, could we do that as a select instead? And they may push back and go, no, there are going to be thousands of customers, doing that as a modal makes more sense. Or another option that we talked about was, what if you start at the customer screen and then click a create service order button on the customer that automatically fills all that information in for you at the create service order screen. So there are lots of different UX options. Whatever you decide to design around is completely up to you. If I said there were no right answer, but definitely wrong answers for the ERD, that is even more or less true for the mockup, right? Mockups are just, there are things that you wouldn't want to do, like expose customer ID. That would be something that would be wrong. We would definitely want to provide an interface for them to pick a customer. But in terms of design, right, very subjective. There are people, literally, we talked about full-time database engineers. There are full-time user experience designers. We just hired one of them at Tuzag. And so it is entirely possible to design it differently. Up to you how much you would like it to feel like a wireframe as opposed to a mock-up. The requirement is just for a wireframe, but if you would like to go down the design rabbit hole, you are free to do that. And the same goes for diagrams.net. I just reached for that because we were using it for our ERD. As you are using it, you will find it either infuriating at how fickle it can be at adjusting things, or you may find that you like another tool more, or you may fall in love with it. So if you would like to get out a whiteboard and wireframe on your whiteboard and just take a picture of it, that's fine with me. I will probably provide a little less feedback if it is handwritten, just because handwritten things are harder to grade than if it's done in the software. But you can still get full credit for the assignment if you decide to do it on a whiteboard or a piece of paper. I call it the Cheez-It box method. Down at the Tech Garden in Syracuse, I had Office Space, really cool partnership they had with the iSchool when I went through the program. Unfortunately, it's no longer part of the program, but you got this Office Space, and I was working with a business partner, and we literally whiteboarded out our wireframes by taking a Cheez-It box, putting it on the wall, drawing a rectangle around it, and going, all right, this is our first screen. And we talked about what should be in the screen, and then we took the Cheez-It box again and traced it out and went, all right, here's our second screen. So wireframing, if you are going to have a deliverable for the client, obviously having something handwritten isn't ideal. But we are at the point where you guys are still learning all of this stuff, right? So for the assignment, completely fine if you want to turn in something handwritten, just with the caveat of you might get a little less feedback on it from me. But if there were no right answers for the ERD. There are definitely no right answers for the wireframes and or mockups, depending on how far you want to go. Any questions on the homework assignment other than Kyle's? We should limit wireframe based on MVP or put whatever features in we think would be more useful. It depends. If you think you would be showing this wireframe or mockup as part of your portfolio, I would say feel free to go as crazy as you would like to go. If you want to add in additional features, if you want to add in additional styling, if you want to go crazy, I'm not going to stop you from going crazy. I know that based off of what the 8 screens we've added to the wireframe, we're already going to be hard pressed for time to get all of those features done, especially as we start going and running into different issues. And so we're going to figure out the pacing tonight. I'm going to try my absolute best to not go Roadrunner speed. But at the same time, this should largely be a review for all of you guys. And so I feel less bad about you stealing code that we're covering in class at the beginning of the next day just to stay caught up. So there won't be an assignment at the end of this that's like, turn in the entire appliance case, right? Like that would be insane. That would be like, turn in your entire capstone and do it in a week. Like we're not going to go that far. So I'm going to cover more than what we have covered. We're going to cover more in class than what the final assignment turn-in is going to be. I haven't quite figured out what the turn-in will be for this weekend or what it will be for next weekend. But I would say if you would like to code along, you can, with the caveat of I know I'm going fast. And we'll try and adjust pacing kind of as a day-by-day scenario, if that makes sense. I've scared all of you off. Now I only have 3 students on camera. It's all right. Any other questions about the homework assignment or what we have done in the wireframes? That was only a small call out on guilt for not having cameras on, by the way. I know you all well enough now to know that if I were going really too fast or you really had something to say, you'd throw it out on the chat. So I'm a little bit more practiced now at reading the chat and knowing where you guys are at. Plus, I'm going to go so fast anyway. Just kidding. I will try and take it slow. I promise. Okay, so we've got our wireframes kind of figured out. We've got a starting point. And there are times that ideally your wireframes would be done, your mockups would be done, the client would get you feedback on them, you'd be locked in before you touch a single line of code. Because from this point forward, and to what Carolyn was mentioning of, oh, well, if we just throw that in the wire or in the wireframe, then we're good to go, right? Oh, well, what about the mockups? Oh, what about the components around that? What about storing that data in the ERD? Oh, now we've got to adjust our back end, right? So we want to do everything pre-code as much as possible and get the client to sign off on them. Good news, I know the client, he has come back and he has said, your wireframes look great, go ahead and run with them. So we now dive into the next step. Now, like I said earlier, next step could be varied. We could go to the back end and start doing all of our models out for that. We could go create our back end, but we're going to start in our front end and we're going to try and get all of the front end components up and running. And then we're going to kind of do our database and back end setup kind of at the same time and start linking all of those things together. So I am going to share my screen. I'm going to pop open. Nope, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pop open VS Code and make sure I don't have any code from work open in VS Code. And then I will start sharing my screen. Carolyn, if you would like to code along, you definitely can. We're going to be focusing on Bootstrap and the front end and getting our project set up with a dash of React in there. Oh, Ariel had a great question. She called me out and said, you hypocrite, you're a terrible teacher. you used varchar in your ERD. And I mentioned don't use varchar, use string instead. It really depends, right? I said think about your database and how it's going to get stored in your database. The problem here is we're using an ORM that kind of blurs those lines. So in the database, like if we look in Beekeeper Studio, when we say data types dot string in our SQLize model, what that's really doing is creating the varchar column type in our Postgres database. The reason why SQLize calls it dot string is because in other databases that use SQL, they won't call it a varchar, they will call it a string itself. And so when we say varchar, it may not only be Postgres, but I know for a fact that Postgres does use varchar instead of string. The good news is SQLize kind of takes care of that for us. So what you would want to do is identify your data types before you create your ERD and be consistent about that. So for me on the ERD, it probably makes more sense to be consistent and use the SQLize data types because that's what we're going to create our models with. That's what's going to create our tables for us. And at which point I broke my own advice and was very hypocritical and used varchar instead of string. I don't know how well the find and replace works in SQL in diagrams.net, and I'm way too lazy to change them all by hand. But if you followed my advice, you would use string. Now there is a flip side of that to be said, and I hope you guys got a taste of this last night. Of there is no right answer, but there are definitely a lot of opinions out there in the developer community. Someone may argue, no, you shouldn't do it based off of the data type of your ORM. You should do it off the data type that your database is using. So, hey, because Postgres calls them varchar, you should call them varchars in your ERD, because it is entirely possible that the database engineer is going to create this ERD to you and hand it off to you as a developer, and they're going to think of those columns as varchars and not strings because that's the column types they created in the database. So while I think of this as I'm approaching a project, I'm using SQLize. SQLize is going to manage all my data types for me. I should put string in my ERD. There's a flip side of that to say, well, yeah, but what should really go in your ERD are the data types that your database uses, not your ORM uses. So either way, if you gave this to an experienced database engineer or to someone who uses SQLize frequently, they would look at a varchar and know that that's a string and just automatically use a string, and vice versa. If you gave this to a database engineer and it said string, the database engineer would go, oh, I understand by string, you actually mean varchar. So I was hypocritical and mixed things in here. But it is possible to think of it either as what's the data type going to be in my actual database, or what is my data type going to be in SQLize. Either way, just be consistent, and that was the one thing I probably wasn't on. With that said, there is a difference between varchar and text, and so that is an important thing to call out. Text can be an unlimited length. So you could put paragraphs and paragraphs into text. Varchars are almost always limited to 255 characters. So you don't really want to create a varchar. Some databases will actually let you specify, I would like more than 255. They all default to 255. But for the most part, if there is an open-ended input, you do want to use text over a varchar. Okay. I love seeing a thank you, as in like, all right, I got the answer. You can stop answering now. Totally kidding. All right, so let me go back to sharing my screen here. I'm going to go into my open, and I'm going to go into my code module 7, going to create a week 2 folder. going to create day 2 because this is only the second day we're teaching this week. If it makes more sense to call it day 3 for you, call it day 3. You do not have to follow every naming convention that I go through. I'm going to create a new folder and I'm going to call this appliance backend. And we'll get to that in a second. And then I'm going to open up day 2 itself, not the appliance backend folder. Now you're saying, Max, I thought you just said we are working on the front end. We are. But if you think about Create React App creates the folder for us. So we want to be in the folder that it is going to create the new folder in VS Code. And echoing what Karen said, yeah, I'm starting from scratch on all of this, so no need to pull anything. That may change next week, but for now we're gonna run with this pace and see where we're at. So again, I'm opening the day 2 folder. I'm not opening the appliance backend. So I'm gonna pop that open. I'm gonna right click over on reveal and find. I'm sorry, on open an integrated terminal. And while it does say that I am in day 2, if you accidentally right-clicked here and open this in the integrated terminal, you could always cd space ... and that would move you one directory up. But what I am going to run is a pwd and make sure I am in my module 7 week 2 day 2, which is where I want to be, not in the backend folder. And then I am going to npx create React app, and I'm going to call this appliance dash front end. Always make sure your spelling is right when you run create React app, because it is a headache to change that down the road. And now we're going to wait for React to get situated. Thank you, Ariel, by the way, for that question and reminding me of it. I told you I was going to go over it, and 2 minutes later, promptly forgot to answer it. And just because I know internet speeds are different for everyone and create React app can take a while, I'm actually going to start a poll for the in-class exercise. And I haven't even gotten it working yet, so I'd be surprised if any of you are. But you just want to be able to do, after the install goes through, do your npm start and make sure you get React running in the front end. Okay, so my install just finished. I'm just going to run npm start. Nope, I'm going to cd into my appliance front end and then run npm start. And if my front end wants to start, it will show that. And I'm going to, in the student pasted code channel, because Zoom hates it when I type code into the chat, I'm going to add in our npx create React app appliance front end, and then we did our cd into appliance front end, and then we did our npm start. Commands are in student pasted code C2, just in case you lost them, because it's kind of hard for me to screen share my terminal. But our end result that we're going for is our React app showing up here.
Excuse me, Max, we npm start from our appliance front end folder?
Correct.
Thank you.
Or you npm start from the wrong folder like I did and get some cranky error message that npm cannot find the command start, and then you cd into the right folder and npm start again and it works.
Yeah,
One
that's
of the two.
what I do.
Got 6 votes in. I think 8 is the magic threshold, but I will give everyone just one more minute. Seven votes in. Kyle, you want to share your screen? Did you create React app needs dashes between create React and app? And you can hit enter at any point in the command. You don't actually have to get to the end of it to hit enter. I know it's a pain with arrows sometimes. I believe you can also, let me go back to sharing my screen. I don't know if this is something that I just set up in my terminal, but if you pop open a new terminal and you type something wrong, if you hold in the option key on your Mac, which is between control and command, and click where you want the cursor to go, it should jump your cursor there. That's a little pro tip for you. I don't know why they require you to hold down the option key. I'm sure there is some technical reason on the server. But if you hold in the option key and click where you want to go, it should jump your cursor there. Again, not sure if that's something that I set up manually. And then even if you're over here, you can just hit the enter button and it will run the command. It's not like it's gonna split the command into 2 lines or anything. Yes, Carolyn, end goal is to see this rotating React logo. Yeah, it's the cursor being so fat dates back to when you SSH into another server. SSH stands for secure shell. SH is the shell part. But SSH is pretty much the dominant way of connecting in to any Linux server, any non-Windows server, where you will only be able to run commands. You don't get to use a UI on the server for the most part. And so that's why the cursor is so fat. It's just terminal's been around since, I was going to say the 70s, probably since the 60s, and it has not been updated much since. When you said TP, Carolyn, did you mean CD?
Sorry, wrong button. When you were explaining about the command key and doing something or other, I missed that, but I noticed in your terminal up in the top left part of your terminal, you had like %TP or something. Was that a command you typed in or was that from HTTP? I wasn't sure what that was. It's gone now. Mustn't have been anything that mattered.
No, I don't think it is.
Okay, as long as I didn't miss a step. That's
Nope,
all.
you're good. Just
Thank
the 3 commands. As long as you got a spinning React logo, you're good to go.
Yep. Thank you.
Oh, I'm not paying attention, and we got 12 votes in the poll. All right, onwards and upwards. Okay, so I'm going to jump over to my front end, and there's probably a smart way to tell create React app, like don't try and be good and and do all of this fancy stuff for me. Jahil, if you're on 3001, that's fine. It just means you've got a React server running somewhere else or a backend server running. The port number that the front end runs on, not super important. As long as you can see it, that's all that really matters. But because I don't know it, I'm going to start clearing out files. Karen, if you could just document a list of this, because I don't know that we've ever shared it. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to delete out my app.css file. I'm not deleting the file itself. I'm just deleting the contents of the file. Then I'm going to go to my app.js and I'm going to delete everything that is inside my div, but I'm going to leave the div itself. I'm going to save that. Then I'm going to go to my index.css and delete everything that is in my index.css and save that. And then I am going to delete my logo.svg, and that I'm actually deleting the file on. And then I'm going to go back to my app.js. I'm going to delete out my import for my logo, and I'm going to throw in a hello world. Thank you. Okay. So I know that was fast. I deleted everything inside app.css. I deleted everything inside the div in app.js and added in an h1 that said hello world. I deleted out the import for the logo file. I deleted out everything inside of index.css, and then I deleted out logo.svg. So next step, I'm going to go to getbootstrap.com, click get started, come down, grab my CSS, go to my public and index.html, drop in my style sheet, and then come back over here, grab my JS bundle, come down to the bottom of the file, throw that in after my body tag, close out Bootstrap documentation, and confirm that my Hello World font has changed from Times New Roman to something that doesn't look like it was from the previous century. And stop there and see. I know it wasn't a long time, but it was a lot of steps. So I'm going to relaunch the poll just to see if anyone has questions.
Max, what was the thing you deleted besides the app CSS, the index CSS, and the logo thing in the apps .js? What was the other thing?
I deleted out the div in app.js and just made it say hello world instead.
Yes, but wasn't there one other? Was there one other thing?
App CSS, index CSS, logo.svg, the import, and app.js. I believe that's all of them.
Okay, I did that and it's saying it's failing to compile, so I missed something.
You probably deleted too much. Do you want to share your screen, or are you on 2 devices?
I'm on 2 devices, but thank you.
What's your error message other than failed to compile? You're muted.
It's oh geez, module build failed. ENOENT, no such file or directory.
So that happens sometimes when React gets cranky that you deleted a file. So I would recommend Control-Cing out of the server and restarting the server and see if that makes it go away. Sometimes it's not what you did wrong. It's that the code, the server's cranky that you deleted a file while it was running.
Yes. Thank you.
And Susan, what you threw out of delete the import at app.js, that would be my next step to debug that. Make sure you deleted out the import, but sometimes the server just gets cranky, even though you deleted the import and you're not using the file. It's like, whoa, you changed stuff that I was running. I don't like you doing that. So I only have 6 votes in the poll. Shaw, if it cannot find index.js and you've tried deleting, if you've tried stopping the server and restarting the server and are still getting that, you may have accidentally deleted index.js instead of logo.svg. If you do not have an index.js file, I'm going to direct message it to you in Slack. You can just create a new file called index.js, copy and paste what I just sent you in Slack, and then restart the server and see if that works. If it doesn't, feel free to screen share if you're available to.
Thank you, Max. Let me try that. Thanks.
Sure. Got 7 votes in. Give everyone 1 more minute and then I will keep going.
So Max, there should be nothing, no more content in the local logo.svg file, correct?
You can delete the entire logo.svg
Entire
file.
Oh, okay. All right.
That's the
So-
only file that we deleted. Everything else we just cleared out.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I got 8 votes in on the poll, so I'm going to keep going here. We are going to, when Joey showed you React Router, did he do anything in practice? Did you guys get to install it? Or was it just like a, and here's why we need a router?
He covered a lot with router.
Excellent, excellent.
I remember us just doing a lot, but I mean, it feels distant now.
Well, that is the whole point of me organizing the curriculum the way I have. Is this is meant to like really take you start to finish on a full stack app, including all of the planning, but also recovering everything that we've already done. So you guys probably have more experience than I do at this point with React Router, especially during project setup. So I use React Router every day at work, but I don't frequently set it up from scratch. So this may be a slightly bumpy experience. Let's see if we can get through it smoothly. Hopefully you guys will be able to help me if I get stuck. I did a search for React Router on Google and got to their documentation. React Router is also the dominant routing platform for creating React Native apps. Because we are not creating React Native apps, we're just using regular React. Regular React is almost always used for the web. So we're going to click on the web button, and I'm just going to grab this npm install and call them out and shame them. You should never npm install without a -- save unless you really know what you're doing. So I'm going to copy and paste that. I did have to hit Control-C to stop my React server. I'm going to npm install React Router DOM and do my -- save. The reason why we need the DOM version of it is that's what's telling it to install the web version. It actually uses a couple dependencies under the hood to pull that off. But that's why it says React Router DOM.
Hey Max, can I just jump in?
Yep.
You just copied that line and then you just did right on it, -- save, no spaces, what I mean? Okay.
I did a space between React Router DOM and -- save.
Oh, okay, thanks.
The space is what tells npm, hey, this is a separate command, as opposed to trying to install a package called React Router DOM -- save, which that package obviously doesn't exist. So the space is what separates out the commands. Okay. So we have that up and running. I'm going to npm start before I forget that my server is not running. And that should kick off. Then I'm going to go back to my documentation and look at our quick start. So our quick start is showing us we've got some links going on. We've got some imports, and we've got our switch statement that is rendering our components. Okay, all of that's good, but we need some different components to get to. So in an effort not to just throw away code, let's actually start thinking about our pages, right? So I'm going to come down to my source. I'm going to right click new file, and I'm going to create a page called login.js. And I'm going to say const login is equal to some function component that is going to return a div. The div has each one that says login goes here. And then while I am in here, I'm going to export my default login. I will copy and paste this into Slack once we get everything up and running. Brielle, do you have your spaces right? If you have 19 vulnerabilities, you don't have to worry about that. That's
Yeah.
Jahir, we don't have to worry about that. Brielle, it should be npm install npm space install space react dash router dash dom space dash dash save.
Yeah, maybe I put in an extra space between, if there's an extra space between the end of that, because I copied and pasted it from the website, but space dash dash, is it, if there's two spaces?
The two spaces shouldn't matter. If you can't get it working, you can try doing your npm space I space dash s space and then your React router DOM.
Is it okay to install the React router DOM twice, or do I need to uninstall? Okay.
It is fine to install it twice. What npm will do is will add it to your package.json file and also update it to the latest version if you happen to run install on a package that you have already installed.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yep. Yes, you do have to use npm. You cannot use npx. npm and npx are two different packages, two different commands. npx is used for running things you don't necessarily want to install or worry about what version you're using, like create React app. And npm is the package manager itself, which is keeping track of what's installed and actually installing it. They are interrelated, by the way. I believe they're maintained by the same companies, but npm and npx, two different things. Okay, I'm going to keep going here. If you're stuck on a later step, I'm happy to go back when I launch the next poll. Just want to get our React router working. Okay, so we've got our login.js. I'm going to create another file that is going to be our customers.js. And we are going to do a const customer is equal to an arrow function that is going to return another div that says customers. Oh, yeah. And we will export our default customer here. If you're wondering why I'm using default exports instead of named exports, you are welcome to use named exports as you want. If you want, I like to do an export default just so every file has a default export coming out of it. And then if I need to export more additional things, I can always do a named export on top of that. But my general rule of thumb is do a default export on every single file. So just in case you import it wrong, you have a default that shows up. Okay, now I'm going to go back to my app.js. And for the first time in a I think for the first time ever, you're going to actually see me copy and paste code. And so I'm going to take this entire import and drop it into my app.js file. And then I'm going to take this router tag and replace my hello world with that. And then I'm going to come down to the switch and just grab a couple of the switch statements, and then I'm going to close it out, the tags out that I have left. So with that said, I'm only copying and pasting code because I understand what every single line is doing. So what we're doing is we're saying, hey, start with a router, right? Whatever is going to come in here is going to be components, and those components, the router is going to know what to do with. We then do a switch statement. What does the switch to? Does anyone remember from Joey's lessons? It's like an if else. It is changing the pages. It's basically going to make sure that we don't have multiple roots showing up at the same time. Because theoretically, you could have a root that matches two different things. And so what the switch is doing is it's saying, heads up, just pick one of these roots coming in. And it's Kyle, you're not wrong. It is like an if else. It is making sure we're only falling into one of them. Okay, our path is /about, and we pull in an about component. And React is really cranky about that because it's like, what the hell is about? Never heard of it. Who's that? Well, we have our login and we've got our customers, and that's what we want to focus on. So the first path I'm going to do is I'm just going to do a /. And that's because we want to target the root route, the ROOT space ROUTE. Made that mistake in a previous module, will not make that mistake again. The root is saying just load at when someone goes to your page for the first time, this is what we want to show up. So we are going to say that is going to be the login component. And I'm going to hit enter here, and VS Code is going to do this very nice thing and auto import it for me. If I just typed in login and I clicked somewhere else, you wouldn't get this import automatically, and you would be getting something that's saying login is not defined. So it's up to you. If you want to import it manually, you can. If you would like to just hit the enter button and have it auto import for you, that is also fine. Now, React is warning me link is defined but never used. You know what? We're not using a link right now, so we're just going to remove that import. Okay, so we've got that working. I'm going to push my luck a little bit and add in one more route one more route, excuse me, called customers. And I'm going to make a customers, nope. Customers. I missed an S in my customers file. Because the screen is going to show information about multiple customers, we will want to call it customers with the S. We are going to create another page for service orders that shows all the service orders, but then we'll have a second page that shows the service order detail. So we want to be careful with our singular and our plural. Are we talking about multiple service orders? Or are we talking about the details of one service order? So we want to be careful with our S and our S's. It will work with or without it, but we want to represent what kind of information is going to go on that page. Because we're going to have information about multiple customers, we're going to add an S at the end of that. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my app.js. I'm going to make sure my customers is here, and then I'm going to just make sure it's imported properly. So I'm going to say customers. I get my import showing up. I'm going to go back over. I know I'm going fast. I'm going to take a break in 1 second. I'm going to refresh my React app. And it's cranky. It's saying element type is expected. Okay, well, let me go back to my login file. I've got my return and my login working fine here. In my customers, I've got my return here, and it's returning a div. All of that should be right. I'm going to go back to my app.js. My app.js is returning this router and all of this stuff. And if I refresh here, it's cranky. Well, just like when we deleted a bunch of files, we also just created a bunch of files. So I'm going to guess and hope that this isn't an actual problem with our code. It's just the React server not running. My gut is telling me that's the case, because if I blow this up, if you look at the stack trace, it's not really looking or pointing us at any of our own code. It's like deep within the React rabbit hole, right? And it's blowing up with Webpack and all kinds of stuff that is way too technical for anything that we have touched. So I'm going to hope that if I Control-C out of this and start the server over again, going to refresh and blow up at the same spot. Okay, so I broke something. I've got no idea where. I'm going to pop open these stack things, the stack trace here, and see if it's blowing up anywhere in one of my files. That's helpful. And of course it's not. It's blowing up in node modules itself. So we've got to do something wrong. We've got to be doing something wrong. But it says check the render method of app. So we're going to start at app and work our way down. First of all, I'm going to comment out all of my React router code, and it loads fine. So we are going to go line by line. This is a React web app. You are not covering React Native web. I'm sorry, React Native. React Native is for mobile apps. So I'm going to comment in line by line. I'm going to just comment out. I want to get my React router showing up. And I'm going to comment out my switch statement. I'm going to come back over and we don't have errors. So sometimes we just need to go line by line to figure out where it's blowing up if the stack trace isn't helping us. This is all in app.js. As soon as I get this working, Jahil, I will share all 3 files that we've created and open up a poll. All right, so I'm going to add in my switch statement next. And I'm going to comment out my route, my route. And refresh. All of that's still working. All right, so now I'm going to add in my customers. And that appears to be working. I'm going to go to /customers, and my customers is showing up. Okay. I'm going to go back to my login. That blew up. So we have pinpointed it down to something going on in either this route or the login itself. What happens if I take this and I put it down here? Now we know the order of it matters. We still have it's in here and it was blowing up when we had this above higher up. So now let's come back. I'm going to delete out my customers and it blows up. But when we go to our customers, it starts working again. So we have pinpointed that it's got to be an issue with this, but because we prioritize customers and made customers come up higher in the file, it is not blowing up now quite as much. Okay, so let's see if the problem is in our customer or login file or with the route itself. So I'm going to replace login with our customers component because I know customers is working. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to delete out my customers and customers, oh yeah, shows up. So we now know it's not even a problem with the route. It's a problem in my login file itself. So I'm going to go back to my login file. And there's one little thing here that caused all of this debugging. I forgot to freaking save the file. Save, my login goes here. So I, of course, knew that I forgot to save the login file and just wanted to demonstrate the multiple steps of debugging. Of course, right? Okay, so what we should have working is if we go to localhost 3000, login goes here will show up. And if we go to /customers, we should get customers, oh yeah. And that is where we want to be at. That is a monumental task of getting the router installed and just getting it switching between pages. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to launch the poll. And I'm going to copy and paste all of that code over in the student pasted code channel. And once I do, I will open up the floor for questions. I believe those are the 3 files we've been working in. If I'm missing any, let me know. Got 7 votes in, which is actually more than I was expecting to get done. 1 or 2 more people vote in, and then I will dive back into it. Want to take a moment to recognize that if I did this in the past, you guys would be screaming bloody murder that I was going way too fast. I can't keep up, slow the heck down. And now look at you guys. You're following along, you're understanding what's happening. We're adding complexity. We've got routes in here. We're creating new components in separate files. Really, really good sign. We're making bad life decisions like drinking coffee at 8 p.m. All right, we've got 10 votes in, which is over my threshold. Anyone stuck? I'm happy to screen share. I'm happy to slow down. We're making good progress. We don't have to rush.
Can
Guys,
you just go over why customers had to be first again? Maybe I missed that.
yeah, I don't actually, let's find out.
Because my customers page wasn't showing up at all until I switched them.
So what's happening is if we switch the two of these, there were actually 2 problems. One was login just wasn't saved, and so saving login made it show up. But that exposed the second problem of what happens if we put login first and we are on /customers and we're still getting login goes here, right? So the thing that it's doing is the switch statement is making it so only one thing shows up. So hypothetically, if we wanted multiple routes to show up, we could take out our switch statement and see both login goes here and customers. But if we removed out our customers, we would only see the login goes here. So what the switch statement is saying is make it like an if else, make it so only one thing shows up. The problem that's happening is that our path is matching on this slash because when we go to /customers, this /customers has that slash in it. So what's happening is it's going, I don't care that customers is a closer match to what you want to use. I am going to match on the first thing that comes up, and this technically matches. So what we want to do is we want to prioritize our routes, and this goes in Express as well, and basically match it on the more specific things first, and then leave our defaults down at the bottom or our last cases. You could also actually build a 404 page using this. Okay, if it didn't match anything, then use our 404 and get it to show up. The other thing that you can use in the route is something called exact to say if it is an exact match, make this show up, which is just a prop that is built into React Router, and the route knows what to do if you pass in that exact prop. I'm going to leave it just like this for now because it's doing everything that we need it to. But if you wanted to, you could use the exact prop, and there are all kinds of other things that we can do on that.
Thank you. I remember this now. Thanks.
Yes, the point of this week is, while yes, we're covering new things, but hopefully we're pulling in things that we already covered in the wireframe. Hopefully we're covering a little new things like pulling in the ERD, but pulling things in from the previous modules. Hopefully hopefully we're making light bulbs go off that may have either not been on or were a little dim and we had to flick the switch a little bit to get those light bulbs to pop back on. The root route by definition, Mel, does not have a name. The root, R-O-T, is always at slash and whatever. It's kind of like your index.html. That is always at the root. So you can't really name the root route. However, what you can do is if you wanted to, you could say, well, I would like it to work so when I go to /login, it also shows up. So if I go to login, great, that shows up. And if I delete the /login, it also shows up. But what you don't want to do is leave this root out, because if you do, now you just get a white page, right? We want something always to show up at our root, our OOT. So what we do is we say, hey, by default, make it go to the login page. Now there's a lot of complexity around getting a login screen to work. And that is a thing that I think I am going to have to tackle next week, but I'm going to drink through the weekend to figure it out. I mean, hydrate myself to figure out how to cover that in the best manner. For now, we're just adding in our login page, and I want to get rocking and rolling on some Bootstrap components tonight. And then we will have time tomorrow to start getting into our 3 other wireframes. Mel, did that answer your question? Basically, you always want to have a root route, but that doesn't mean that you can't reuse a component or have multiple routes that use the same component. You could also do a redirect, which is more common, but that's crossing the I need to be drunk in order to figure out how to teach this right sober. So I will be doing that this weekend. Carolyn, I will save time, like 15 minutes at the end of class. It probably is a syntax error in your app.js. If you copy and paste the whole app.js from Slack into your file, if it doesn't fail to compile anymore, it's a problem in your specific code. Not saying you should just take copy and paste my code and run with it, but I will loop back with you in 15 minutes and we can go over why you're held up there.
I actually did this time, in the interest of time, just did that. And later I will go and like type it on my own and check.
Cool.
So it is your code.
Oh, you got to fail to compile on my code?
Yeah. I wrote over whatever I had in there because I couldn't keep up. And then I just copied yours in for now.
Go ahead and share your screen just in case I copied and pasted something wrong.
Okay. I don't want to embarrass you. This is where'd you go? Gotta get these Zoom things out of my way because I can't.
So whenever you get, so what do you think that error is telling you?
Okay.
Look beyond the failed to compile. What is it's failing to compile, but why is it telling you it's failed to compile?
How'd you not customers in?
So it's saying cannot resolve /customers. Whenever we see a /, we think file path. So if we look at your files, you don't have a file called customers.js. So it can't find a customer.
Right here.
You do. What folder is that in?
It is in the source folder.
It is not in the source folder. It is in your appliance front end. You need to move it into the source folder.
Oh, thank you. That's probably the whole. I thought I put it in there.
You want to drop it right on top of source. You want to move it in the source folder, not in the appliance front end folder.
Excuse me. I keep putting it. Yeah, I keep putting it where. Sorry.
So go ahead and move that. And then you're going to want to, and then your server just auto restarted for you and it's now working.
It's not working. Yes, it is. All right. Great. Thank you.
No problem.
I thought I had put that where it belonged and I kept putting it up in that app one. All right.
Okay. All right, we're making progress. We're making such good progress that we can take a little break from our code, believe it or not, and go back to our lovely wireframes that we are so proud of. So our wireframes, ooh, boy, that's tiny. Okay, so we've got our appliances RS navbar up at the top. Navbar, that seems like a good component that we should break up. Oh, okay, and then we've got our username and our password and all of that stuff. So let's get our username and password showing up, and then we can get our navbar working, and we might be able to call it a day. If we're feeling super adventurous, maybe we get our sidebar up and running. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my getbootstrap.com. I'm going to go find in the docs the nav bar. I'm going to scroll down, some super basic nav bar with a whole heck of a lot of code in it. So if I expand this out, I'm getting a little bit too much here. There's a lot going on there. So I'm going to scroll down and look at some other examples. And this is probably the most basic nav bar that has everything in it that I want. So I'm just going to copy that whole thing. I'm going to go to my source and I'm going to create a new file called navbar.js. That is going to be a const navbar equals a function component that is going to return copied too much there. It's going to return my nav. And we've got our appliances are us here. I'm going to save it. I'm going to go back to my code. Login goes here. What did I forget? I did forget. I did think to save this time. Thank you, Mel. It does not have to be. Oh, yep. Latonia, you're right. It does have to be on the same line. So I put it in parens. And Shaw, you got what I was putting down. We have to now go to our login screen and actually use our navbar component. So I drop in my navbar and we get an error. Navbar is not defined. Yep, so we got to import it. So we're going to import our navbar from our /navbar. And we get another error. Import error. Navbar does not contain a default export. All right, fine. We'll export default navbar. Save. Got our appliances are us. And if we want to be true to our mockups, we can go back to our navbar, which I'm already in. And I'm actually going to look at Bootstrap. I noticed they've got this BG light going on. I'm wondering what else they have going on. So I'm going to go down to the color schemes. And oh, would you look at that? They've got a bunch of different things for us, including custom styling. But I kind of like that blue. It's almost like I picked out that blue when I was designing my wireframes. I'm going to save that. I'm going to go back to my React app. We get our appliances are us. And I'm going to look. I'm kind of surprised. Oh, you know what? I need navbar dark in addition to my primary. So I'm going to change that light to a dark. I'm going to save. We got ourselves a nice little navbar going on there. All right, we're going to keep going. I'm going to go close out of my navbar because we're done with that for now. And I'm going to get working on my login. So I'm going to do a div class, and I'm going to put all of this in a row. I'm going to use my grid system. I'm going to do a div class name, bad max, we're using React, class name is equal to a col-3, and I'm not going to put anything in it. Why? Because if you look at our design, you will see I've kind of got that centered in the screen. So we can actually do a 3 and a 3 and make this a 6 in the center, and that's going to get it centered. I'm actually going to do a 4, and a 4. Now, note, it is very common in mockups and sometimes even in wireframes to do multiple mockups targeting at least 3 different screen sizes, well, at least 2 different screen sizes, mobile and desktop. And then sometimes you even do a different one for tablets. So it is very common to do multiple wireframes or multiple mockups or a combination of the two. But we're just going to target desktop for now. There's a ton of mobile responsiveness that we could go back in and layer on top of this using Bootstrap and the grid. But I'm just going to do a col4. I'm going to leave that empty. And then I'm going to do a call name with another -4. And then I'm going to just make sure that's showing up where I want it to. So I'm going to say username and save that. Go back to my React app, and my username is actually kind of showing up where I wanted it to, right? It doesn't really look that way. So in order to prove that, I might come in here and add a style border and do a 1px solid black and see, oh, that's actually exactly where I want it to show up. Maybe I want to move it down from the top, but for the most part, I want to work with that. Okay, so I'm going to take out my style black. And I'm going to jump back over to Bootstrap. I'm going to go to, I'm going to search for forms. And oh, would you look at that? There's a nice email password all working for us. Hey, I think I'll copy most of that. I'm going to grab that. I'm going to dump it in my column. And I'm going to be careful to make sure my classes are my class names. Actually going to do a find and replace. So Command R, where every class, and replace that with every class name. Notice I threw an equal at the end to make sure it didn't replace my existing class names with class name. So I threw an equal at the end to kind of just trick it out. I'm going to save that. And it's mad because do I have too many closing divs?
You gotta have like a main div covering it, or either a fragment.
No, it's in its own div. It's in its own column. Form has no corresponding closing tag. Div, 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 div. My button, my form. I'm gonna just take this whole code and bring it out. Deleted a div I didn't want to delete, so let me add that back in. Okay, all of that's working. I add my form tag back in. East, delete this extra one. All right, sometimes you just got to indent yourself to figure it out. It's underlining that div, so that makes me think that their problem is in there. What happens if we start? All right, back up here. Everything is working inside of that. I'm just going to grab the first one and let's try and copy and paste smaller chunks of code. Are you mad at the described by? Mad that the input tag is not closing. So the Bootstrap code, if you look at the input, you notice they don't have any closing tag. React is more strict about closing input tags than regular HTML is. So basically, we just have to add this slash in at the end of the input, and React stops throwing a fit about it. So I'm going to grab these other two and the button. I'm going to throw them in down here, and then all I need to do is close out my input tags. And now React won't throw quite a big fit. I'm going to delete out any additional spaces that came in. I'm going to replace my class equals with a class name equals. So React is happy and we're following those conventions. I'm going to jump back over here. Got my email address. I've got my password. Now, I think they're being overly verbose or will never share your email with anyone else. So I'm just going to delete out that whole thing. We probably don't need a check me out checkbox. So I do appreciate the pun. So I'm going to delete that whole div out. What did I say about submit buttons? I think submit buttons are dumb. What are you submitting? You're actually logging in. Gonna jump back to my wireframes. All of this is looking good. Come back over here. Maybe I want my button to be all the way across like it is in my wireframe. So I'm going to come over here on my button. I'm going to say style is equal to width at 100%. We're rocking and rolling. That looks nice, but it's kind of contained, right? What happens if we go back to Bootstrap and we go look at a card? Hey, that kind of looks nice. All right, div class card, and then we put it all in a card body. So what happens if we come up here and in our col4, we say that whole thing is a card, and our form is actually the card body. Hey, looking snazzy. All right, let's just push that down a little bit from the top. So I'm going to say our card has a style of a margin top, and we'll say, I don't know, 30 pixels. I like it. All right. We've got 15 minutes left in class. Give me 1 second to get the poll. I'm going to give everyone the option to either stop here, or if we want to get ambitious and get our sidebar working. Actually, no, screw it. I'm not giving you the option. We're going to get our sidebar working, and then we're going to call it a day. Being ambitious. All right. So our sidebar doesn't show up on our login page, but maybe we want to get our login page, at least the button, taking us to our customers, right? So what we're going to do is we are going to wrap this whole thing in a link. And the React, see how it says auto import from React router DOM? That's actually exactly where we want to pull it from. So we're going just to hit enter, and that's going to auto add the link for me from React router DOM at the import up at the top. So I'm going to say link to our customers page, and then that link is going to be the entire button. So now when I'm in my browser, if I click login, get my customers. Oh yeah. Okay. Making really good progress. I'm going to save this. I'm going to close out of some extra files I'm not using. I'm going to go to my customers. First thing I want to do is add in my nav bar. And due to the beauty of React, we can just reuse that code. Not quite sure why my auto import wasn't working. But we pulled it in anyway, so we're good to go there. I am going to throw my entire app in a container fluid, because we should always be working inside a container. So we are going to, we could do the container on every page. Let me just see how this scales responsively. Yeah, I kind of want that nav bar to be full width. All right, let's do the container fluid on the sub pages instead. So in my customers, well, in my login, I should put all of this in a div class name equals container fluid. We obviously don't need it because it worked without it, but it's always a good idea whenever you're using the grid system to use a container before you start using your grids. So I'm just going to go back to my login page. That didn't break anything, which is good. And if I expand this out, still keeps it the same size. Go back to my login. Okay. I'm going to go to my customers. Before I start doing my sidebar, what should I be doing? Well, I guess to start my sidebar, how would I start my sidebar?
Create a new component.
New component, exactly. So I'm going to delete this out. And I'm going to just do, I guess I should create my component first. New file, I'm going to call this sidebar.js. If you wanted to call it nav, you could, whatever makes sense, whatever floats your boat. Do a const sidebar is equal to a React component. Going to export const export default sidebar, save, go back to my customers, throw in my sidebar. It auto imported it for me. I've got sidebar showing up. Okay, great. Now I want to go back to Bootstrap, and I think let's look at their list group. This kind of looks nice to me. We could do it as independent buttons, but I kind of like that list group showing up. So what I'm going to do is for my customers page, I'm going to put all of this in a div class equals container fluid. And I'm going to move this into one giant row. And then I'm going to say my sidebar is going to take up, and I'm going to go back to my mockup and say, I don't know, maybe that's a 2 and a 10 or a 3 and a 9. Let's say 3 and a 9. We can always adjust it later. So I'm going to say this is going to be a col 3, and I'm going to put my sidebar right into it. So I come back over here, no major difference, but if I throw a style border 1 px solid black and not put it in parentheses. My God, I am making typos left and right. I apologize. All right, we've got our sidebar showing up there, kind of at the right spot. So I'm going to power through list group. Last thing I'm going to do, I'm going to grab this entire UL. I'm going to remove my border because we don't actually want that showing up there. Save and go to my sidebar. I'm going to drop my sidebar in there and replace my classes with my class names. Going to go back over here. That's showing up. I said save my border, so that's not in there. All right, little bit of styling and then we'll be done. I would like my sidebar to not be at the top of the screen. So I'm going to add a style here, my margin top 10 px. I would like the height to be, and we're going to get fancy here. We're going to say I want it to be 100% minus whatever the height of this nav bar is. So our nav bar, I'm going into inspect and blowing this up so you can hopefully see it, has a height of 34 plus 8 plus 8, right? Because that's our padding on top of that. So 34 plus 8 happens to be 50, which would make sense. So I'm going to say 100% minus 50 px. Spaces are super important whenever you use a calc. CSS is very, very particular with their spaces, especially within a calc. And then the last thing we're going to do is we'll add a background color of E6, C6, C6, just because I know that's a gray off the top of my head. And VH. VH stands for viewer height. And so that added it in gonna get really cranky with me on the margin, isn't it? Because that margin is coming in from our columns. All right, one last thing we're gonna do, and then I promise I'll be done. I want to go to the grid system. And the grid options have a gutter width. And so basically what it's doing is it's giving us some space to breathe. Let me make sure. Oh, is that just coming from my container? What happens if I take my container out? Yeah, then we got scroll issues. All right, I'm going to stop here because I have a feeling I am losing you guys. We will fix the spacing and the gray stuff in next class. There's some padding going on, and so next class I'll go through how we get that kind of anchored over to the side and how we can fix that. But I don't want to go through too much. I guess the last thing we could do is just go into our sidebar and copy in whatever's in our wireframe. So we could just do our LIs and just say.
As far as that padding that's kind of being enforced by Bootstrap, you override that with our own style sheet or with the React style sheet?
Yeah, we could do it. We could do it with.
You're thinking?
Yeah, we could do it with either. We would just have to fiddle around with it and figure out how we want to take it out. But before we would do that, we would want to make sure we knew where it was coming from.
Exactly.
And it could be coming from the grid system or it could be coming from our container. So either way, we want to identify that.
Good point. Yeah, so that's definitely a next class thing. Definitely. I just want to make sure I'm on the right, frame. So thank you.
Yep. So I'm just going to finish dropping in our reports, our parts, and then finally our sign out. All right, so we got all of that in there. If I go back down to normal screen size, I don't hate the way that looks. Little style cleanup that we can do around the white space showing up, but for now I'll take that as is. So I'm going to share. Stop sharing my screen. I'm going to paste this code into Slack and then we can stop for any questions. If you don't have any questions, you can actually get out of here 7 minutes early.
Hey, Max, this is kind of like a side question. I noticed when I was working on can you hear me okay?
Yep.
When I was working on my React stuff, it kept wanting to rename my files for me. And I know you mentioned earlier it wasn't auto importing something. I'm just curious, is that something that we do set up? Because I don't remember setting that up, but it was doing it for me automatically, or at least asking me.
It shouldn't be changing your file names. I'm
no,
not
I was asking
sure
if it wanted to change it though. And if I said yes, like if I clicked yes, it went ahead and changed the file name.
In the bottom right of VS Code, does it say JavaScript?
Yep.
I've got no idea.
Okay. That's okay.
It shouldn't be. I believe you that it is because that sounds like a very VS Code thing to do. But it should be offering to auto import. It shouldn't be offering to rename the file itself.
I pressed it. Well, it was React. It's the same difference, but okay.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure why it's doing that. Has anyone else had that pop up in VS Code of like, would you like to rename your file to? It may be an extension you have installed, Latonia, or something that you have in your VS Code configured a certain way. If you can capture it doing it and send me a screenshot of it, I can definitely look into it, but not quite sure why it would be doing that. Karen has put the 30-second feedback form in Zoom, please don't rip me a new one on how fast I went at the end. I tried to pace myself all the way to the end and got a little excited. I already updated the last Slack message I sent with all the code. So instead of sending it as a new message, I just updated it.
It just hadn't refreshed on my screen when I checked. Thank you.
We will have a homework assignment for turning in some version of this at some point. So if you, I mean, obviously copying and pasting all the code is not what I'm looking for in the assignment. If you want to wait until you are done your wireframes and then build out your version of your wireframes in the code, that's completely fine. So I probably won't have a homework assignment to turn in the code that we're working on today and tomorrow due on Sunday. So the big thing will be getting your wireframes up until the point that we have covered. And then you probably would want to do the setup. So the homework assignment for this weekend, in addition to doing your wireframes, will probably be getting React Router up and running and getting a backend project set up with SQL up and running. So it will just be the project setup steps will be the homework, but actually getting the app up and running won't be due on Sunday. Just some shell that you can use next week, if that makes sense at all. When did I lose you guys? Did you make it up until the sidebar? For the most part? Login? Let me back it up. Did I lose you at login?
What was
All right.
the sidebar?
Okay.
I think it was the in the closing tags is what that means.
In the what?
The closing tags, you said it didn't like the way they were. That's what that means.
Yeah, let me share my screen on that because that had me stuck, just to reiterate what's happening there. If we look at the Bootstrap code and go to forms, you see how they have this input tag here, and they're passing in all of these HTML attributes, which are the equivalent of props in React. We've got all of these HTML attributes, and then at the end, we just have this arrow. That input isn't closed, right? And so in HTML, it's like, oh, it's an input tag. You don't need to close an input tag. I know that input tags are self-closing. But in React, we put that in, and React was like, whoa, where's your closing input? We need that input to be closed off. So when I added that slash in, literally right where my cursor is, that was enough to make React happy. And then all of a sudden, all that code was working. So that's what got us.
Now, why would it throw off everything else? Because I followed my error message and it had me removing the slash from other tags when all I needed to do was add in the slash on the input.
95% of the time, stack traces will be helpful in trying to tell you, hey, this is what you're missing. There is 5% of the time that the computer thinks it knows what the problem is, and it's really somewhere else. So it's just sometimes I mean, you saw it had me stuck because I'm like, all right, I know the Bootstrap code isn't broken. Like, I know their documentation is not wrong, which more often than not, you would be surprised at how many times the documentation is just wrong. And the package creator is like, oops, sorry, like forgot to put that in there. But in this particular situation, it was just that closing tag. And just like we had to go through our debugging and figuring out why our React router wasn't working, I would take the same approach on that code as well, right? I would just start commenting things out and start figuring out how many lines can I copy and paste in here before it breaks. And so I was almost at that point before I realized, oh, it was a closing tag on the input. It is 8:30. I will stick around for another 5 minutes in case anyone has questions, but you are free to leave. I did create the homework assignment for just creating our mock-ups and our mock-up wireframe Frankenstein monsters that we've created in diagrams.net. That will be the homework for this weekend. And then I will create another assignment that will also be due on Sunday for get your front end and back end set up. But that won't show up until tomorrow because we haven't even started our back end setup at all. So if I lost you in tonight's class, do not worry. There is plenty more Bootstrap component creation that we will be doing tomorrow. We've got to get our customers page up and running. And then I think I'm going to pause there on the front end stuff. And we're going to switch to our back end and do all of our back end setup and get SQLize up and running, get our database working, get all of the CRUD operations working on the customers. And then based off of how that's going, we can decide to dive into appliances and service orders and all of that stuff. But plenty more coming. I will start at a much slower pace tomorrow on getting the sidebar fixed and getting our customers component built out there. So lots more to come. Do not worry if you were behind. If you fell behind today, don't worry about catching up. We will have plenty more practice in Bootstrap. All right, you guys have an awesome night. I will still stick around for a couple minutes just in case anyone has any additional questions, but feel free to jump out of here. Don't forget the 30-second feedback form.
Why does Bootstrap, I guess, like alter your screen size or whatever? I don't know how to describe it. Like I was rebuilding my capstone in React, and it looks completely different from what it was when I just did regular HTML.
When you did regular HTML, were you using Bootstrap?
Yeah, I was using Bootstrap for both of them, but maybe it might be React or something like that.
Yeah, I would check. You probably have a style sheet going on somewhere in your React files that are being imported that are altering the Bootstrap system. So like if you didn't clear out your app.css and index.css, it's possible that something might be lingering there. That's just a guess. It is definitely possible to get your React project set up so that your HTML is matching whatever is in your React code. The other thing I would say be careful of is make sure that you're using class name and not just class, because that could be another thing when you moved your code over from HTML over to React, that the classes aren't lining up. But I would probably say that other than the classes, it's probably a project setup thing. So if you get your project set up properly, the sizes should be the same across your React project and your regular HTML.
Yeah, I just cleared it and actually fixed the problem. So thank you.
No problem.
All right.
Latonia, I think that's just a bias against liking React more than HTML. No, there are definitely things that while on the surface, the design shouldn't look any different, there are issues you catch quicker because React is doing your error checking for you and telling you in the terminal when something isn't compiling. It's also that you're reusing your components so that now when you actually, make one card and want that card to show up 3 times, you're not getting messy or having duplicated code or a tag that's not closing out right. Theoretically, React shouldn't be any cleaner or look any different than your HTML in the browser itself, but React definitely makes it so it's easier to catch those errors and makes the styling look a little bit more clean. But in theory, React shouldn't be doing anything CSS or styling wise different. I will put the code in the classroom repo, Carolyn, but it's all in Slack.
For the sidebar? Or I'm missing one of them.
Yeah, sidebar.js is the last thing in the message.
Yeah, and then, I guess I'm looking at navbar and I have a blank
Oh.
file.
Let me, yeah, I did not share
Yeah,
navbar.
that's the top. Yeah, thank you. And that's when we got fancy with the container and the fluid and I followed you, but I didn't code, so. All right, thank you.
Oh, I wonder if that's why it got cranky. Yes, I think about my code of it being cranky. I didn't realize what I pasted in. And again, the dangers of pasting in code, that that there was a container fluid already in the nav bar. So I'm wondering if I can take this and add my container fluid back here. Nope, it breaks things in all kinds of places. Okay, I never did any of that. And like you didn't see anything that I just did. Putting it back to the way it was. I am going to fix that gray thing, but I will probably end the recording unless you guys want to see it before I cover it in class tomorrow.
So I can paste the navbar code for now. I'm not going to use pasted code. It's just
Yes,
to
you
get it
can.
in my, and everything else has stayed the same, or do I have to change anything else since you tweaked what you just tweaked?
Everything is the way it needs to be at the start of class tomorrow in Slack.
Okay, but I did take the stuff, your most recent updates. I already took and put in VS Code except for navbar, and then you did something with navbar.
Yep.
Did you subsequently do anything else with the others, or if I
No,
got
everything is the way it should be in Slack.
Fantastic. Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.
I will go over this tomorrow, so if you want to drop out, you definitely can. It's just going to annoy the crap out of me until I figure out that col has padding on it. And so if I override it and just take that padding out, that's doing what I want it to do. And then there's also some padding coming in and margin top. There's some padding on this. So basically we can fix that by coming in here and saying we're going to take out that margin, and then we're going to say padding is 0. And it's not actually padding there. It's going to be padding on this. Takes care of that. And then we're going to go to our sidebar. And on the list group itself, we're going to add some style. That's what I wanted. See, only I could have done that during class. Anyway, I will go over that tomorrow of where I added padding and why I added it there. Now I'm going to back out of everything so it matches what I left you guys with. Customers padding. Back to being ugly, back to being ugly. Okay. All right, that's all I got unless any of you guys have questions. All right. See you guys tomorrow.